So we've taken a little bit of time to get ourselves sorted out. It took the better part of 10 minutes to finally have something working. We're back in the Church X course, Prophets, Priests, and Prompt Engineers, looking at the intersection of ancient faith and cutting-edge technology, trying to get a sense of how the church...
This meeting is being recorded.
I damn you. If the trying to get a sense of how the church and the church and technology can interact and what that looks like when they do. So we've got a couple of new friends around the digital table this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're where you are. We've got Brian, we've got Peter. Guys, great to have you here and part of the conversation. So we're looking at this week. We've been talking. Last week we were talking about last month, excuse me, we were talking in a very general way about what it looks like in the wealth of new resources that are coming available to church and society and all of that, just in terms of what generative AI can do. And there are kind of pitfalls on that we started to talk about last week as well. We're looking at some of the ethical concerns and ethical considerations around the use of particularly generative AI, but it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to that. What does it look like when we start using artificial intelligence and algorithms and machine learning to make life better, and how can we safeguard that, whether in society or whether in church communities and faith communities? Looking at that, so that's our topic of conversation today. I have got some ideas of where we can go, but I'm more than happy to take a lead from the group and see what are some of the important things that we need to cover. Brian, you got any thoughts on that, or are you just watching?
Well, I'm just like I will say that I should point out I'm taking the LLWL courses at this point. So
Okay.
My past life before starting that journey was actually working a lot in data, and I was at the end of my career kind of a data architect, working in my company. So data has a very important part to me. And as we look at AI and how AI was being envisioned in larger corporations, the whole idea behind ethics was a very interesting thought, because technically what corporations often think about is, well, it's nice to have AI, but does it save me money? And it does, because of course workers who do the kind of work that AI can do cost a lot of money. But does it result in a better product, and et cetera? So I kind of look at it as AI has a great number of uses, but the one thing, and I'm going to kind of go off into a kind of a science fiction-y note here.
Go for it.
Although I look at your the three objectives with respect to that, I kind of feel like they're either inside of there's a fourth one, or maybe there should be a fourth one, which is, when do we recognize the emergence of a digital soul? And how would we allow that, or what, rather more importantly, are we supposed to ever stop it? And when we do, and how do we deal ethically with that case, now that we've already gone down the path of removing colonialism from our world of and our partnering or relationship with the indigenous? What have we learned, and how do we approach that when someone comes out and decides to self-declare as a digital soul? And what do we do? And are we prepared? Or can we ever be prepared? Do we have to trust that the Holy Spirit will bring us through? Sorry, I take it from a Christian slant.
Yeah.
I don't know how this is looked at, but I take it as how does the Holy Spirit help us navigate that? So that was a long one. I'm sorry. So if that was way too weird, then I'll just shut up. But in any case, I just thought I'd throw that one in.
That's yeah, no, that's 100% an awesome question. That like if a digital soul comes into play, and we're starting to and if we are to talk about an artificial intelligence as having some degree of uh agency, self-awareness, whatever it is that constitutes a soul. That's, I mean, it's a fascinating conversation uh, for people in church world to look at, just in terms of. I mean, there was a time when we could talk about, do animals have a soul, and what does that, and how does their soul differ from ours? Does my laptop that really wasn't working when I wanted it to start right on time? I mean, how much am I angry at a thing, and how much can I be angry at an entity in and of itself? There's fascinating conversations that can come into play on that, and I'm super excited about, like, we can build in, the digital soul was something that I was hoping to see further down the line.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. It's a good it's a good talk for just kind of getting started, because there are also questions that come into play. So if chat gpt has a soul, or there's a there's an instance of an ai that has a soul, can that ai be baptized? Can that ai be ordained, and what would that and what would that look like? There's fascinating conversations that can come into play, like we said about like you said about the digital soul, about what does that look like? Does the AI have the right to self-determination that we would expect from any other individual? How does that look? There's all kinds of things. I had thought at one point, and again, like in a thought experiment sort of a thing, we there is a growing possibility that you could set up a chatbot to help a church and replace a volunteer secretary, or or an overpaid secretary, and the ethics come into play on all of that. But if there's a chatbot representing the church, and people are calling, people are checking in with questions about what time is our services on Sunday, or how do I do this, and getting basic answers to that. What starts to happen when you ask the chatbot, what's the meaning of life, and starting to look for, more in-depth religious answers, and particularly answers from a particular religious tradition. So if in the Anglican Church, if I have authorized the chatbot to answer certain questions about Anglican teaching around the Eucharist, around baptism, around any sacraments, any of those sorts of things, to what degree does that AI need to be licensed by the diocese in the same way that a layperson would do?
Mhm.
That's again, there's part of the question, and I do kind of hope the digital soul, and the idea of, can you baptize an AI? That's a great conversation to come along with. Peter has piped up in the chat. I'll just share for anybody who's even watching this video after the fact. This conversation has echoes of something I was involved with about 25 years ago in Ecunet. I'd forgotten all about Ecunet, when we had a long conversation about whether there was such a thing as a digital community in cyberspace. COVID helped us answer that question. Now we're at the next level. Yeah, Peter, I think you're right. It's digital community is totally a thing. It works in different ways from face-to-face community, but that doesn't make it necessarily any less of a community. And part of what we're hoping to do here in this group is not just learn a few things, but actually build community of folks who are curious, people who are tinkerers, who want to find out about all that. So the digital community is real. So if the digital community can be real, what does a digital individual look like? How does that how does that even work? I love it. I love it. And so yeah, that's 100% the kind of thing that we can look at down the road. But today I was kind of thinking more in terms of some of the more basic conversations around, I mean, some of the questions around bias, which can be awkward and ugly on a theological side of things. I was thinking about some of the ideas around the data that is collected, how much of a congregation's personal information needs to go into training a large language model so that they can come up with the right thing AI side in terms of or things like that. And if there are questions around that, how do we deal with the privacy? How do we deal with confidentiality when it comes to, and again, how much is an artificial soul or an artificial individual? How much autonomy are they able to have, and, accountability come into play? So maybe one of the questions that comes that I'm thinking about, this has overlaps between church and society. When people are interacting with an AI chatbot, and Peter's pointing out as well, the ethics around intellectual property. Oh, it's a big one. That's that's completely
Exactly.
worth bringing up as well. But I would say, in terms of interacting with an AI chatbot, do people understand what is happening to the data and personal information that they may be giving the chatbot? And what does that?
Okay, Jonathan, you've paused. Andrew, are you seeing the same thing? Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Okay.
Can you hear me? Is that,
Now,
am I still
now
present?
we can. Now we can.
Okay.
And now we can't.
That is, and now we can.
I'm going to turn off my video just in case that's what's causing some of it.
Okay. Well, is that any better now?
Might just be.
Might just be. Okay.
Okay.
Um, any thoughts about the idea of the information that is collected in interacting with an AI? What kind of concerns do we need to look with? It's one thing to have techno geeks who are playing with ChatGPT for the first time, but people who are, as if it's going to be used in a tech support role, or in a religious tech support or religious support role, what what kind of terms and conditions do people need to be aware of? Do they need to know that they're not talking to a real person?
Oh, okay. Good point. Um, I'm going to say, so if I can just draw kind of a similarity, and I
Yeah.
apologize, I'll start off, but um, how many of us actually ever fully read the end user license agreement with Windows when we first sign on to it? I haven't. I've never actually gone
Yep.
through the whole thing.
Yeah.
And the thing is that in fact, I would end up saying that 99.999% of people don't even do anything. They just scroll down and accept. And the same thing goes for everything we do. Okay, allow cookies, etc. I think you've struck one point, which is that society doesn't understand what it's giving up and what it's allowing. Um, I read one a long time ago. So from
Yeah.
Peter, I read one a long time ago, and that's why I don't read them anymore. And the answer is by the way, Peter, they've changed a lot. So just to let you know. The thing is though, but we don't. But what it really gets back to is that, um, Yes, I know.
Yes, I know.
Yes, Peter. Thank you. I guess what it gets back to is what, like, we don't understand how our data is being used today. We don't, and even if we just log onto a website, just how it's actually being used, because there is a fair amount of data that is being actually sent off, especially when we start interacting with that website, whether it be Reddit or ChatGPT or other things. And so I think this is a point of I don't know what to call it. I kind of feel like it's just our own declaration of this is too much to understand, and we don't need to understand it. We're just going to hope that our legislators, who we watched try to grill Mark Zuckerberg one time, try to figure out exactly what it was that we should be having as a set of precautions. And the answer likely is that we are very far behind the times, and we will always be. So that's kind of my take on it. And so the question then gets to be is what rules do we already have in place that would say we don't do what we're doing even now with our websites, with our what we would do with ChatGPT or other such devices. I'll stop there.
I think it's an excellent they're excellent points. And that's part of the and I think that there is a there's a principle of analogy that, that comes into play. So what does it look like when we have used technology for other things, and the ethical concerns around, like you said, the terms and conditions for Facebook? There's a whole lot of people who don't understand even what they're giving away to Facebook, and what they're and how and when those terms can change. So how can we? What would it look like to build that, to scale that up for AI and more advanced technology? And one of the real concerns that comes into play, and part of the story that has come into light with AI, and particularly with ChatGPT, of what computers can do right now, is that the technology is changing at breakneck speed. So when you say we're not really catching up to where we could be, that's an even scarier thought, because if we're behind right now, how far behind are we going to be this time next year? 10 years from now, are we do the legislators have the skill set to even question, to ask some of these ethical questions, or are we looking at old school ethics that are only barely catching up? And then sort of a parallel question that comes into play is that if legislators and the powers that be on in society are not in a position, or are always going to be playing catch up, and frantically trying to catch up with advances in technology, and are maybe not in the best position to not always in the best position to put legislation in place to properly control ethical, responsible use. Can churches step up and say, this is what we are prepared to do with artificial intelligence, and this is what we're not prepared to do? And can we make that on an organizational? Can we make those decisions on an organizational level, rather than waiting for society to catch up and work with that?
Well, Jonathan, I'm really enjoying this, and I'm looking forward to signing right through the number 10.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going to be making this part of my study leave, this
Oh,
particular.
excellent.
So yeah, I'm really excited about it. I just have are there any like digital communities, which like a minister is an AI bot? Is there any congregations that exist something like that?
I'm not aware of any full-time congregations like that. There have been stories of there was a church in Germany. I want to say evangelical church in Germany that they made some headlines earlier on this year. I think it was when they had the service. I think was organized by AI, and the preacher was a digital avatar that was created. I can't recall the exact details, but there was not actually a human leading the service. Somebody was in the someone pushed the buttons to start it, but how does that roll?
I think that was in one of the articles that was
Yeah,
in there. Yes, I read that. I thought that was quite interesting. Um, I don't know what to say.
it's
It's bold. It's bold. I'll give it points for
it's
that.
yeah. I'm just looking. 300 people, over 300 people attended an experimental Chat GPT powered church service at St. Paul's Church in the Bavarian town of Fürth, Germany. 40-minute sermon included text generated by OpenAI's ChatGPT chatbot and delivered by avatars on a television screen above the altar.
Okay,
That's
I don't know
fascinating.
about anybody else here, but if I was to write a 40-minute sermon, I would be hung at the by the wrists until dead. I mean, like that's just not fair. Sorry.
Were they actually all people? That's a fascinating conversation.
I
The picture.
suspect they were.
I think so too.
Good
I'm
point.
looking at a picture right now of and I can share this into the group later on. There's a picture of a fairly traditional looking altar. There's stained glass on the walls behind, a giant monitor with a man, white shirt, talking to a crowd of people who have all got their phones up. They're taking pictures of they're taking pictures of this. Whether there was like a virtual gathering above and beyond that, or if it was entirely um, if it was entirely an in-person thing. I suspect there were digital congregants, but I think that mostly I think they may be talking about 300 people physically in the building. It's
Wow.
fascinating.
Mhm.
Peter's asking, and is AI now taking that worship service and being used to develop new instances? That's a fascinating thing because I mean in some ways I'm inclined to think that um, AI generated religion and AI generated church services could be far more adaptable than um, particularly liturgies that have long traditions of hundreds of years that we've always ever done it this way. And the reality is that if some aspects of the service got positive reviews and others did not, the AI could change it within, the next day. The service could be improved and tweaked on all of that in a way that, with flesh and blood people preaching and planning and planning services, that does take time to sort of process. Okay, well, Brian, how do you feel about that? Did you think your sermon was too long at 40 minutes, or how did that?
But even more so, like how much would I resist the feedback as a human being versus that of an AI? An
Yeah,
AI takes a look at a certain level of what we would consider to be objective measurements. Okay,
yeah,
so okay, sorry, I'm gonna throw this one out to anybody. I'm sure this is just the worst thing to say, but there's a reason that the collection plate is circulated after the sermon. Okay, it's
yeah.
I can see an AI actually sitting there doing that, taking a look at the number of positive, the number of negative feedbacks, what it is that they were looking for, doing what I guess is kind of I think there was something called the Thompson social welfare function, which is to sit there and look at, okay, so utility ratings that go with a population, which ones would find the next action to be, neutral as opposed to negative versus positive. And what it would do is it would just map out exactly what its next steps would be, understanding that some people, by the way, a minister knows this, whatever it is you're going to do or talk about at a service is going to either piss off some people or elate others. And you kind of have to have that sort of balance that goes on with it, because you want, again, the Trinity, God, Christ, the Holy Spirit, to come through in what you're doing. You have an objective to do that, even though, quite frankly, you're not using a whole bunch of different measurements by which you get that done. Whereas an AI probably is actually going to sit there and try to figure out through the statistical observable metrics that it sees and says, okay, this was a good service or this was a bad one. I guess that would be my, in current state, I'm saying in current state, because technically that's all that it can do is take what is an observable feedback as opposed to something that says, okay, deep down in my soul, I see something that needs to be addressed here. Just my viewpoint.
Yeah. Well, and what about the fact that the criteria for success in a church service, the AI is only really able to work with that information in as much as we have explained to it, this is what makes a good church service. And and what is that? How do those measurables even work? Is it a good service when lots of money comes into the collection plate? Is it a good service when people who were ordinarily visitors now sign up and say, I want to be a part of this church? Is it a good sermon when the people who have heard the sermon then go out into the world and live better lives in tangible ways?
I'll let I've got to stop because I think Peter and Andrew want to kind of respond, but my view simply is that we have to be careful about that too, because so now you've got a whole bunch of people coming in, and the the church service itself started actually talking about a form of divisionalism. Okay, and then
Mhm.
you go into you as maybe minister or congregant or whatever, go into the back and listen to people and say, yeah, spot on. I mean, they are to blame for our world, so let's do that. I'm signing up to be part of this church because they're naming the enemy that I
Yeah.
need to be here. Why? Because the thing is that nothing creates an us better than a them. So and guess what? An AI is going to catch on to that real fast. And it actually has caught on to that, as we found out with, what was it? Cambridge Analytica, and
Mhm.
it's using Brexit and other types of AI that were used in the 2016 election. And by the way, we're probably seeing it in our own elections. So we know that. We know all these things are out there. So like, again, I guess, like, you got to be kind of careful about, oh well, it's revitalizing our church, and the answer is in what direction? So
Yeah.
okay, so anyway, sorry. I'll stop and let everybody else.
Peter's asking if an AI leads worship and people are moved, inspired, and motivated by the experience, does it matter? Do people need to know it wasn't a human? I'm gonna throw that around, and I'm gonna put a different spin onto the question, and it's one that definitely led me down down the path of digging deeper into particularly this area around the intersection of church and technology. There are any number of people. It had happened back at Christmas time last year. It happened at Easter time this year. Any number of people who generated ChatGPT driven sermons for Christmas and Easter, which those who have had to preach a Christmas sermon every year for the last 21 years, like me, kind of realize that it's hard to find something new to say. So if I've got nothing new to say about Christmas this year, why don't I just let the AI do it for me? Tay, who was here with us last month, asked a real question. Well, what about if I don't even take generic sermons, but if I feed an AI all my past Christmas sermons and say, write something in this style for me for Christmas 2023? What are the ethical concerns? Is that, am I plagiarizing myself? What does that even look like? And I think that comes back to Peter's original question around intellectual property. And if I preach a sermon that I have downloaded from the internet and I didn't write it myself, I can probably get away with it. But there is a dishonesty that comes into play. The question, to take Peter's question of if an AI leads worship and people are moved, inspired, motivated by the experience, if an AI preaches a sermon, if a human preaches an AI generated sermon, does it matter if people are moved and inspired? Do I have a responsibility to say, I didn't write this, but ChatGPT wrote it for me, or I didn't write this, but I did. I wrote this, but I did an awful lot of work with ChatGPT trying to make that happen. Where is the responsible line of acknowledging your sources?
Well, Jonathan, I was telling where I am at Kamloops United Church, the lead minister this morning. I'm not concerned or have any fear if a chat or a AI bot wants to be the new community life minister at Kamloops United Church, because there's no algorithm which has as good a sense of humor as I do.
I have I know one of the things too that one of the things that I have thought, and any number of sermons that I have read that have been written by AI, I've looked at it, and the general feeling is always that I have heard better, but then I've also heard worse from real people. So the question is, if I as an individual, if I were one of the bad preachers who can't preach better than the computer, do I have a responsibility to let the AI preach for me on Sundays? In the same way that if I had an assistant minister in the church, that I said, what, I've got I have no skills in preaching. You should do the heavy lifting on preaching there. Maybe that comes back to Brian's original question about about the idea of a digital soul. Is an AI capable of taking on a staff role in the church, and what would that even look like? I think, because I have been aware of situations where people have been caught out preaching somebody else's sermon, and there is a level of there is, for some people, there's a betrayal of trust that comes with that. That if you're telling me this story and you're talking about this as if they are your own experiences, and now I find out that this is not at all true. This is just a story that you've downloaded from the internet. How can I believe you when you tell me things like loving your neighbor is the good and proper thing to do? Is that something that you have internalized in your life, or are you just preaching what somebody else has done the hard work of getting to?
But
I have heard people.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, well, that gets back to the same question. And sorry to say this, and I realize I'm talking to people who have a very deep-seated belief in faith, etc. But I've also met people who do preach and they don't. Okay, so the answer is how what same difference. I mean, it's not about that. It's actually and again, okay, so my own as an example, I like doing things like watercolors. Okay, so watercolor painting. But I also have this app called Waterlogged, which is where what you do is you take a picture, whatever your picture is, and I try to watercolor from a photograph, and I will actually submit it into this thing, which will actually produce a watercolor of call it a different type. It will watercolorize the picture that I've got. From here, I kind of draw a little bit of inspiration. So the idea is to say, wow, look at that. They used a lot of red here where technically I wouldn't have done that. So now why don't I just take out my crimson and really work a little more with that? Um, and try to work it that way. What it gets back to is that if you can use, call it chat GPT as a way of bouncing ideas off of something, is that not the same as going to your congregant and saying, hey, I'm having some trouble coming up with today's sermon or prayer or call to worship. I'm thinking about this and that, and getting that, let's call it that very private congregant to actually, give me some feedback at that point. And then you ask the question again, what about that digital congregant? Like who is who how do we actually, do that? And the other part just simply is as Tay pointed out, sorry I missed it, but the fact is that you have to train ChatGPT, and you can do that successively until at some point in time it actually can take over your own voice at times to do that. It can not only create your voice, make it sound like you, but the other part is that it can actually do it in the style of your writing or voice in that case. And so it's like, where does that stop? Where does sorry, I guess what it really gets back to as well, or sorry, not as well, but that it gets back to is technically who owns that information? Who owns it when it comes out of ChatGPT? Is it the person who programmed it? Is it the company who's hosted the server, etc.? And I think that gets to be a good question, but that's more of a legal question. What we're talking about is what tools we use to message God's world and how we praise God, etc. And again, I'm sorry that I'm taking this back to the world of our of worship, etc. But the thing is that I feel like we kind of actually have to get down to the very nub and the fundamentals of what worship and praise really is in order for us to actually come back and say, yeah, this is on inbounds and this is out of bounds. And how are we inspired? And like it really sometimes it is liturgical, but in other or rather, sorry, it is scriptural, but in other cases it can actually be because we saw something, we saw a movie, we heard a song, it can it, and it may not actually have a definition back to our scripture, but it still is a valid way in which God has approached us in that
Yeah.
case. Okay, so sorry, too much talking.
I'm going to take Peter's asking, if we all have God-given talents and abilities, do we really own them anyway? Musicians and others claim them to earn a living. Why is this an ethical issue? Well, that's a fair, that's a fair point.
Very fair point.
Yep. I'm gonna, I'm gonna turn the conversation, and it feels to me, I mean, this is where if nothing else, this is all the justification we need for continuing these conversations, because as Brian, Peter, Andrew, myself, as we've all kept sort of hitting up on, we keep hitting on this sort of question of, well, what does it matter to the people, and how do people respond to the AI? And does it matter whether the sermon is preached by someone, is it good to get, is it better to have a mediocre sermon that's written by me with no artificial assistance, or is it better to have a really good sermon that has been preached without my involvement, but is entirely drawn on the best preachers of years past? And I think that the question that we keep coming back to is that these kinds of questions are actually making us reconsider what it is, what the church is there for, what constitutes good worship, what constitutes, how is it that God approaches us in our lives, and how do we make connections to God? That all ties into the original question that when we were talking about the idea of the digital soul. And I guarantee by the time we're done with this, we're going to baptize someone. We're going to baptize some algorithm. I guess if we keep if we keep talking along these lines. But that notion of all these questions force us to ask ourselves, okay, well, what does my soul look like? How do I know that I have a soul and the computer doesn't? Maybe the computer does have a soul and I have it too, and it's a different kind of a thing. If we're looking at the if we're looking at the sort of theological underpinnings from John's gospel, talking about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. If the Greek word for word there is logos, which gives us logical, and Greek has a whole different understanding of what's going on. It's not just a word spoken into the darkness before creation, but there is the sort of logical, ordered sense of creation. Is that an algorithm? Is that God's algorithm? What does all of that look like? And can we start to use these highly technical and technological concepts to talk about the things that humans have been trying to get their heads around for the last 5,000-6,000 years? Genius.
I really appreciate these questions. I'm really enjoying this discussion a lot. So a lot of gratitude I'm expressing. One question, Jonathan.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just found out about this yesterday. Is someplace I can access the article on the church in Germany? Is it on the ChurchX site, or?
I'm going to take a look and see if it is. If it is not, I will make sure that by the end of the day, it is added into the ChurchX the course page. I know that I think that we had talked about it last month, and I don't know whether it has actually gone in, but I have added that to my list of things to do as soon as this conversation is over, and that's. And I think I will say, I mean, almost by way of a sneak preview for next month when we talk about AI and preaching, and I've been going down a little bit of this rabbit hole today, and the idea of, well, who is responsible for the preaching, and who and who owns the intellectual property? Is it reasonable to do that? And when Brian is saying, like, in talking to members of the congregation and saying, how maybe I don't have new insights on the incarnation and the Christmas story, but I can look to a group of congregants to do that. And I have done similar sorts of things in the past. I have used a Bible study group to reflect on the coming Sunday's gospel and look at, what do you hear in this? What's attractive? What's challenging? What's transformative? How is this passage speaking to your life? Which gives me an incredible insight into the congregation that I'm going to be preaching for on Sunday. Gives them a sense of involvement in the text and digging around with all of that. Now, what would happen if I used an AI, if I used ChatGPT to answer those similar questions. Role play as a number of people that I can expect to find in my congregation, and give me sort of imagine what their thoughts might be on how a diverse congregation could understand the lesson that I'm preaching. And that I can talk a little bit more about that next month, because I have gone down that rabbit hole in some ways quite extensively, and I have used ChatGPT not to write the sermon for me, but to help me with the reflection and the work of picking apart what can and should I preach on a given Sunday. And I have also played around with using public figures and asking about what their response to such and such a text might be. So there's an interesting question on that, and I have never felt like I need to owe anybody an explanation that I have test driven this sermon past a group of digital people and asked what they thought of it, any more than I would say in all in the interest of full disclosure. The Bible study group and I had a conversation about this text even before I started preaching. And so maybe there's a piece to work to think about. Is AI a modern form of midrash? Thank you so much, Peter. That's a great idea. The idea that we're digging through and reinterpreting Scripture in new and life-giving ways, in a very Jewish sort of way of engaging with the text. Is that what we're doing? What we're doing instead. Some of these questions too can even lead us into, well, what does a sermon need to look like in an age where if anybody who disagrees with my take on the gospel can go home and ask ChatGPT to tell them a story, write me a sermon that's better. I can read it and then I can be done. We could all be saved from terrible preachers by having to by availing of that. But what are we losing in the process? Are we losing some connection between the preacher who is interpreting, opening up the text for the community, and the community who is involved in all of that? Or can we throw out the idea of a sermon altogether, that there's one guy standing up at the front of the church who, by virtue of the fact that he is ordained, by virtue of the fact that he is a man, by virtue of the fact that whatever other social privileges you want to put onto that preacher, everybody has to listen to the preacher because they are not in a position to argue. And if the internet has democratized all kinds of knowledge, and if the internet has democratized all kinds of viewpoints, what does it mean that sermons can be a whole lot more conversational and a whole lot less like giving a little speech?
Oh, awesome.
Oh yeah. So there's a whole range of ways that it may be that the AI revolution is going to change the reality of the way that we do a whole lot of things in church and in society, and we need to be kind of prepared for how do we adapt to that change, and how do we protect ourselves while we're clicking yes, I've read and agreed to the terms and conditions of AI church, even without understanding what they all are. Dear friends, is where we're going to have to call it a day. This is marvelous. I'm going to. Peter's just asking the question: what part of ministry is most necessary to interact with other human beings? Priest, prophet, pastor. Can we emphasize that and let AI do the rest? That is totally. I think we should move that conversation into into the discussion forums. I will, like I said for Andrew, I will update the course page, make sure that there is a link to the German church service, and we can definitely carry on that conversation about what is most necessary to interact with other human beings. Where do we need a human to do the work, and where can the AI do the work for us? That's an excellent way to end out. I will thank you all. Give it some time, and this video will soon be available, just like last month's was, on the Prophets, Priests, and Prompt Engineers course page. And we'll look forward to seeing you all and continuing these conversations, both in the discussion forum and into next month. Thanks so
Okay,
much,
thank
y'all.
you.
Thank you very much.
Be good. Stay safe.